here, just put it in position and line it up properly, and then once it's lined up properly, just give it a little bit of pressure and the clay slab will stick fairly firmly. I'm just putting that little slip pot next to it just in case it does fall over, but it's really unlikely. So then once the first side is attached, I'm just going to apply some slip to the second wall and then repeat the process, just putting the slab in place and then just making sure that it's lined up correctly, because the more accurately you line it up at this point, the more well crafted the slab box will be once it's finished. So line it up properly and then just give it a little bit of pressure to seal those edges together. The next thing to do is to add a small clay coil to the inside seams of the box so far. So roll out a thin clay coil. Rolling a clay coil is a really simple thing to do, but it can go a bit wrong sometimes and it can go a bit wonky. There's a few tips that you can use to make a nice even clay coil. I've made a video on how to do that, and I'll put a link in this video right now so that you can check that out if you want to. The trick here is to roll a thin clay coil, because what you want to do is you want to add the coil to reinforce the join and to smooth it out, but you don't want to add a lot of extra bulk to the box, so just make sure you roll it out nice and thin. Then use whatever tool you're using to score into your clay to score along the join a little bit to create a bit of a key for the clay coil to nestle into. And at this point I'm not going to add slip to this scored surface, because the clay coil that I've just made, it's quite fresh clay, it's already got quite a lot of moisture in it, and because it's quite thin, if you add slip to a very thin coil that's already quite fresh, it just gets really mushy and it's quite difficult to actually blend it in. So just pressing the fresh clay coil into the join, and remember to support the outside of the box as well with your other hand, so that when you press on the join you're not going to press the clay slab off. And then once it's pressed into the corner, you can use your fingers to blend it in to create a nice smooth seam on the inside surface of the box. And then I'm just going to use my clay knife there to tidy up that corner there. That's a little bit of clay coil has got smushed into that corner, but that needs to be clean because the short side of the box is going to be added to that end of the slab box quite shortly. So just tidy it up first. And then I'm going to add another coil to the remaining two sides. And then once you've added a clay coil to each of the surfaces and blended it in, then the last step in just finishing it off and tidying it up is to wipe it over with a damp chamois leather. Chamois leather is just the perfect way to get rid of any fingerprint marks or tool marks or just little bumps and lumps in the clay, and just gives it a really nice smooth finish. Once you've tidied up the inside of the box, what you need to do is go around the outside and just check all the seams. You'll probably find that there's a few gaps and a few uneven surfaces that need to be smoothed out. One of the easiest ways of doing this is just to get a small piece of clay, quite soft fresh clay like the type that I'm using there, and you can just smear it into the gaps. It's a bit like using filler on a wall. You don't need to roll a clay coil. If the clay is quite soft and fresh, you can just smear it in without rolling a coil, because a coil just adds a lot of extra bulk. You can also tidy the outside of the box using a rib tool. There's a nice green rib tool by Mud Tools, which is quite nice, soft silicone, which does a good job of tidying clay surfaces. So just go around the box and just tidy up what you need to give it a nice smooth finish. This red tool here is a clay shredder, and it's a good idea when you've tidied up the outside edge of the box to just go along the rim of the box just to make sure it's nice and level. I use the shredder to do this. Be very careful with the shredder because it can take a lot of clay off very quickly, so just run it over very lightly and then check to see how the rim is doing and whether it's level or not. It's now time to put the final slab on the top of the box. So what I'm going to do is just cover it up with some cellophane so that the top rim doesn't dry out any more than it needs to, and I'm going to prep the slab to go on top. That just involves slipping and scoring both sides, and then when it's ready just carefully lower the slab onto the box. And then align the top slab with the sides, and then when it's in position you can just gently press it into place. And then once it's been pressed into place, you can start to blend in the seams. And it's the same process as before, just blending in the seams, and then if you need to, if there's any little dips or gaps, just smear a little bit of fresh clay into the gaps and create a smooth surface. And then just repeat that process all the way around the whole of the slab box until you've got a nice smooth surface on each side. Make a little mark on the top slab with your needle tool. This will help you know which side of the box is the last slab that you added. And once you've allowed the clay to set up for a little while, what you can do is you can use a paddle tool, wooden paddle tool, and just tap on the sides, on the edges and on the corners as well. It's just a way of sort of smoothing things off and rounding things out, because very sharp edges and corners break easily when they're just being handled, and also they have a tendency to crack as well when they're drying. So it's a good idea just to round off any corners, and the paddle tool is just a nice way of doing that evenly without, it means you don't have to kind of wipe it down with a sponge and that kind of thing, because if you use a sponge it just adds more liquid to the clay. So just pat it with the paddle tool and then you can just wipe it down with a chamois leather afterwards, and it'll give you a nice soft finish to the box. I've turned the box on its side, and now what I'm doing is I'm going to make some marks all the way around where I want to cut the lid into the box. So I'm just using my ruler and I'm marking all the way around. I'm marking at 2 inches from the top slab, and then I'm going to cut around using those marks as a guide. I'm going to cut the clay using a sharp craft knife, and I'm going to use the straight edge of a roller guide just to make sure that the line is straight. And I found the best way to do this is to do it quite gradually, rather than just gouging right the way through the clay on the first pass. Score in quite lightly into the clay, because the thing is with when you're cutting clay with a sharp knife like that, it's quite easy for the blade to go off at a bit of a wonky angle, and if you're pressing hard and you're going right the way through, that's quite a difficult thing to recover from. But if you're just doing it lightly each time, if you make a mistake, then you can quite easily amend it. So just keep going around, each time cutting just a little bit deeper until you actually go through the clay itself. And you see there the knife's gone right the way through. And once you've gone all the way around the box, you'll be able to remove the lid. And doing it this way, you know that the lid is going to fit the box perfectly. So that's one of the advantages to creating a sealed box and then removing the lid. Now what I'm doing there is I'm just making a little mark so that I know which side lines up with which. Because although it looks quite square, if I was to lift that lid and then turn it around and place it on the other way, it wouldn't fit very well. So I'm just making those marks so I know which way to orientate the lid when I put it back on again. So I'm just tidying up the rim of the lid there using various different tools, little modelling wooden tool, and sometimes using the craft knife or a rubber rib, just making sure it's nice and neat and tidy without taking off too much clay. You don't want to remove too much clay because if you change the shape of the rim, the lid isn't going to fit on it very well, but it's a good idea to just tidy it up to make it look nice and neat. And then I'm going to repeat the process with the lid itself. And then I'm rolling a coil because I want to add a thin coil all the way around the inside edge of the lid too, just like I did with the rest of the box. To make sure that the lid of the box sits securely in place, you're going to have to make a gallery that goes around the top edge of the bottom half of the box. So the way that I do this is I roll out a long thin strip of clay, and the clay, these roller guides are 3 millimeters thick, which is about 1/8 of an inch thick. So roll out long thin strip of clay and then mark it. I usually make the strip for the gallery is about 1.5 inches deep. So I'm just cutting that out now. Long thin strip, 1.5 inches deep. So when I've cut the strip of clay out, what I do is I cut it into shorter chunks because I want a strip of clay to go along each side of the slab box. And you'll see in this picture here, you can see that I've already attached one of them to the far side, and I'm just attaching the second strip to the next long side of the box. So what I do is I hold it up in place. It's not attached yet, I'm just holding it in place, and then I mark with the needle tool where I want to score, and then using the serrated rib tool I just score into the clay again on both sides, on the box and on the strip, and also apply some slip onto both surfaces, and then press it into position. And you can press it into the corners as well. You might find that if the clay's a little bit dry, you can get a little bit of cracking around the corners, but that's okay. As long as it's just little cracks, that's fine. You can just press it in with a wooden modelling tool, and then once it's in position, you can tidy up any tiny little cracks that might have appeared with a wooden, just blend them in with a wooden modelling tool. And then just go along the whole length of the strip, just blending it in and making sure it's really firmly attached to the rim of the box. And then you've got these little end bits to go in to fit into the short ends of the box. What I do is I just put it into position. It's not attached here again. I just put it in position and then cut it to length. And you can remove it and then just trim off that little excess bit. Make sure that it fits okay. And then it's the same process of just slip and score, remembering to put some slip on the end of the strip there, and then put it into position and press it into place. So I'm just giving it a bit of a tidy up, and then here I'm just blending in the seams so that those joins are firmly attached to one another. And here there was a tiny little gap, so what I'm doing is I'm just putting a really small coil of clay in there just to make sure that it doesn't open up and crack when the clay dries. And then Similar sort of thing on the inside, just adding a little bit of extra clay just to make sure that that join doesn't open up at a later point. And this is a tip that I picked up from another video by a potter called, I think her name is Se-Won Lee, I think that's how you pronounce it. I used to smooth off the rim of the gallery using a damp chamois leather, but actually this is a really neat trick. Just use a piece of cellophane, fold it over the edge of the gallery, and then just slide your finger and thumb over the cellophane, and it smooths out the rim of the gallery really nicely without introducing any more water to the clay. And then you need to see whether the lid still fits the base, and the chances are it's not going to go on immediately. It's probably going to stick at a few points. So just give it a gentle sort of wiggle and see if you can feel where it's sticking. And then you can just use your fingers to bend the gallery in just a little bit to see if that helps. If it still doesn't fit after you have pinched the sides of the gallery in and tried to put the lid on again, you can just take a little tool and shave some of the gallery off. But actually I noticed that this one fit pretty much straight away afterwards. It helps if you put a piece of cellophane between the base and the lid, just because the lid will slide on a little bit more easily over the plastic. And then I just go around and just double check that the sides are still flush with the base. And I'm just going to add a few little decorative details to the top of the box now. I'm making 4 small flat triangles of clay, which I'm going to attach to the corners of the lid, and the idea is that I'm going to, once the pot's being glazed, I'm going to use some gold luster overglaze on the little corner pieces to make them look like metal clasps, so it gives it a sort of a treasure trove type of look. And then in addition to the little clasps on the top, I'm going to put a little button on the front of the box too. I'm just marking the centre of the front panel, and then I'm making a small flat oval shape which I'm cutting in half, and I'm going to put one half on the bottom half of the slab box and the other half on the top, and it's just going to look like a little button, which is also going to be painted with gold luster once it's been fired too. So the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some feet to the box. I'm going to make some small square feet. So I start off by just rolling a clay coil and then flattening it out first with my fingertips, and then using a pony roller, just using the roller to make it into a sort of a square coil. And then I'm just cutting them to length and making them 3 centimeters long. And the important thing when you're adding feet to the box is obviously to make them the same size, so that when the box is sitting on the table it's not going to be wobbling around. So cut them to length, and then I'm just tidying up the end bits to make them nice and neat and slightly rounded. And then the last thing that I'm going to do, just to make sure that they're all of the same height, is just give them a bit of a pat with the paddle. Once I'm happy with the size and shape of the feet, I just let them dry out and firm up a little bit, dry to the point of being leather hard, and then I just attach them to the base of the box. And here's the finished box. It needs to dry out before it's bisque fired and then glazed. What I would say about making these boxes is that it's a really good idea to dry them really slowly and evenly. Cover them in a loose plastic bag and let them dry as slowly as you can. In fact, I'd recommend putting a sheet of cellophane between the base and the lid whilst it dries out, because slab boxes are prone to cracking if they dry out too quickly, so do allow it to take its time. And now I wanted to show you how I make a textured slab box. This box has the same dimensions as the previous box, it just has a texture on the outside. So the way that I add a texture, I won't go through the whole process of making the box again, but I'll just show you how I add the texture. I use this masking here. This is made out of craft foam. I just mask off the edges of the slab because I don't want the texture to go on the edges, because then it would make it very difficult to join the slabs together without distorting the texture. And